Unit 3, in our look at the Great Migration, has us look at music as a primary source, or as I like to call it, connecting the heart to the head. Why music? Well, music gives a voice to the voiceless. It helps us provide multiple perspectives in our classroom. It also triggers memory. It can reinforce historical content that you're teaching and enrich that content. Let's take a look at some early African American musical influences on the Gershwins during the Great Migration. These incredible artists and their music would have been heard on the streets of New York during the Great Migration. Let's start off with James Reese Europe. He migrated from Mobile, Alabama to Washington, D.C., where he lived doors away from the great John Philip Sousa and actually studied music with one of Sousa's band members. By 1904, James Reese Europe has left Washington and is now in New York City. While in New York City, he founded the Clef Club, part musicians union and part fraternal organization. Europe was elected the president and conductor of this African American symphony orchestra. These are classically trained musicians. The Clef Club appeared at Carnegie Hall first in 1912 and then 1913 and 1914, giving it respectability and the opportunity for international travel. The Clef Club made its first recording for the Victor Talking Machine Company in 1913. Meanwhile, Europe is writing dance music for the very popular couple Vernon and Irene Castle. Then World War I interrupts everyone's life. Europe enlisted in 1917, encouraged by W.E.B. Du Bois's editorial called Close Ranks, which urged blacks to enlist in the fight during World War I. Commissioned as a lieutenant, Europe was asked by his commanding officer to form a band as part of his combat unit. He recruited band members from the Clef Club and from as far away as Puerto Rico. They became known as the 369th U.S. Infantry Hellfighters Band. Europe was the first African American officer to lead his troops into combat. During one of the battles, Europe landed in the hospital after a gas attack. In his hospital bed, he got a wonderful idea for a song. On Patrol in No Man's Land would be published in 1919. The Hellfighters Band entertained enthusiastic troops and citizens with its ragged music, basically introducing ragtime, an early form of jazz, to American troops and to French citizens. The Hellfighters returned to the United States in February 1919. They toured American cities and recorded songs. Europe is credited with bringing ragtime out of bordellos and juke joints and elevating African American music to an art form. Europe died on May 9, 1919, after a knife attack by a fellow band member. After a public funeral in New York City, he was buried with full military honors in Arlington National Cemetery. His death was an incredible loss to American music. Noble Sissle and Eubie Blake were members of Europe's Clef Club and the Harlem Hellfighters. They were actually the lyricists for On Patrol in No Man's Land. Sissle and Blake were the first famous African American songwriting team and the first African Americans to produce vaudeville and Broadway shows. Blake and Sissel collaborated to create the famous Shuffle Along, the first all-black musical hit on Broadway. The show and its hit songs, I'm Just Wild About Harry and Love Will Find a Way, were so popular that in 1921 the show was performed by 3 different touring companies. It was revived on Broadway in 2016, starring Audra McDonald. Dancing to the music created by James Reese Europe, W.C. Handy, and Irving Berlin, Irene and Verdon Castle made respectable new dances based in African American music. The Castles initiated the foxtrot craze after they adapted W.C. Handy's Memphis Blues. As my friend Rodney Whitaker said, they taught America how to dance from the waist down and were the jazz age trendsetters in fashion. The new dances furthered a black dimension to mainstream social dancing. Nearly all of George Gershwin's piano rolls recorded some form of dance music, particularly the foxtrot. And yes, the Castles were a huge influence on Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Considered by some critics as the greatest band of them all, the John Coquette Orchestra was the first large swing and dance band. The 1926-1927 dance members included Bix Beiderbecke, Joe Venuti, and Jimmy and Tommy Dorsey. When the band had financial problems, Paul Whiteman hired most of Coquette's musicians. It was bandleader Paul Whiteman who commissioned Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue and Ferdy Groffe's orchestration. And it was members of the Jean Coquette Orchestra that played in those arrangements. W.C. Handy, the father of the blues, earned that title in 1912 by writing and publishing the first commercially successful blues song, Memphis Blues. He revered Negro spirituals and the songs of black workers, incorporating the 12-bar form, call and response, and flatted thirds and sevenths in his music. In 1914, he made his fame and fortune writing and publishing the great St. Louis Blues, which became a million-selling sheet music phenomenon. This is before there are even records. 1 million sold sheet music. On August 30th, 1926, George Gershwin gave W.C. Handy an inscribed copy of Rhapsody in Blue that left him deeply touched. The Stride pianists were classically educated musicians living in New York who prided themselves on their greater familiarity with opera, symphony, and the great concert pianists. The Stride pianists influenced George Gershwin in many ways. Lucky Roberts, the Harlem Hellfighters piano player, toured France and the UK with James Reese Europe during World War I. He then returned to New York where he wrote music for various shows. He was the first pianist to record what was known as Harlem Stride. It is reported that Roberts gave Gershwin lessons in syncopation and styling. He made a strong impression on Gershwin's music. James P. Johnson is known as the man who wrote the Charleston. He's also known as the father of stride piano, an influential African-American jazz pianist, and a key figure in the musical transition from ragtime to jazz. Willie Smith enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1916. His valor in battle earned him the nickname the Lion. While in France, he was exposed to major French composers like Debussy, Ravel, and Satie. He became one of the most influential piano players in New York, mentoring great jazz musicians such as Duke Ellington and Thelonious Monk. And he once gave a young George Gershwin a lesson at a party.